what are your initial reaction? What are your initial thought as far as tariff of 26% is imposed on India?
I think it's a extremely high tariff. It's much higher than most observers were expecting. It is an across-the-board tariff. That is again something that people were not expecting. So I think these two things are extremely dangerous and difficult for India, right? Like, because India had sectoral protections against some sectors.
More than 180 countries and territories have been slapped with tariffs ranging in a different brackets. We have our neighbors like Vietnam, Cambodia, those who have been slapped with a higher tariffs when we compare it with India. Tell me, how is it going to impact the global economy? Because this is not what the global economy was expecting at this time.
I think it is almost a good thing for India, because I think, like you said, our competitor nations like China, like Vietnam, like Cambodia, have all gotten substantially higher tariffs than India. Investors dislike uncertainty more than they dislike competitive pressures. So it signals an ever-changing kind of order. So I think trade and investment is going to be massively impacted. There's going to be a lot of uncertainty. You can expect, I think, stock markets.
And let's talk about the IT sector, because that's very crucial as far as US is concerned for India.
So interestingly, as of now, the IT sector is not being spoken of in these, right? Because these are only manufacturing and merchandise tariffs.
Hello and welcome. You're watching Republic TV and Republic Business. Finally, on April 2nd, US President Donald Trump has unleashed a tariff on more than 180 countries and territories, ranging from India. As far as India's tariff is concerned, Trump has imposed 26% tariff and also talked about the higher tariff that India is charging as far as US imports in India are concerned. And to decode the whole tariff game and how it's going to impact the global and the Indian economy, we are joined in by a very special guest, economist and founding director of Federation of Economic Development, Rahul Ahluwalia. Thank you, Mr. Ahluwalia, for joining us and speaking to us.
Thank you for having me.
So, Rahul, first question. What are your initial reaction? What are your initial thought as far as tariff of 26% is imposed on India?
I think it's a extremely high tariff. It's much higher than most observers were expecting. It is an across-the-board tariff. That is again something that people were not expecting. So I think these two things are extremely dangerous and difficult for India, right? Like, because India had sectoral protections against some sectors, and our initial thought was that we will have reciprocal tariffs placed on those sectors. But that is not the approach that the Trump administration has gone with. I think it seems like they have based the tariff calculation on the deficit that every country has, the trade deficit that every country has.
Right.
So a very, very novel approach. Nobody's ever taken this kind of approach to tariffs before.
Right. And he also mentioned while addressing from the Rose Garden that he's also considering currency manipulation and non-tariff barriers and factoring in, and on the basis of that, he's imposing those tariffs, right?
Yeah. So absolutely. And I think this is probably why they have gone with this approach. What they have basically done is they have looked at the deficit that each country has with the US, divided that deficit by the entire import, and whatever that percentage comes out to be, so whatever the deficit is as a percentage of the imports from that country, they have taken that to be the tariff rate.
Right.
That's how they're probably trying to account for non-trade measures.
Right. And Rahul, considering we have a clarity, almost more than 180 countries and territories have been slapped with tariffs ranging in a different brackets. We have our neighbors like Vietnam, Cambodia, those who have been slapped with a higher tariffs when we compare it with India. Tell me, how is it going to impact the global economy? Because this is not what the global economy was expecting at this time. So how do you see the global economy and Indian economy being impacted going forward?
Sure. So there are two perspectives that I would like to bring here. I think the first is just the tariffs themselves, right? So if we consider in isolation and assume that these tariffs are now done. There is no change that is going to happen. In that way, I think it is almost a good thing for India, because I think, like you said, our competitor nations like China, like Vietnam, like Cambodia, have all gotten substantially higher tariffs than India, right? So then we can say, okay, investors and manufacturers who are in those countries will want to move to India to be able to manufacture and export from India. But I think this is where the second aspect comes in, and that it's that of uncertainty. Right? Investors dislike uncertainty more than they dislike competitive pressures. Right? So uh, a manufacturing plant pays for itself over 10 years. If in those 10 years you cannot predict what the environment is going to be, you will not make an investment, right? So I think we should not expect people rushing to make investments in other countries now, right? This is very different from the previous round of tariff increases that Trump had done in his last administration, which was directed solely at China. This is an across the board tariff increase on every country, and it seems to be based not on the tariff rates that those countries are applying, but on the deficit that you're facing with this country. So it signals an ever changing kind of order. So I think trade and investment is going to be massively impacted. There's going to be a lot of uncertainty. You can expect, I think, stock markets to tank substantially today. Um,
Right.
People are not going to like what's happening.
And let's talk about the IT sector, because that's very crucial as far as US is concerned for India. How do you see these tariffs impacting the IT industry ecosystem?
So interestingly, as of now, the IT sector is not being spoken of in these, right? Because these are only manufacturing and merchandise tariffs that are being spoken about. Trump has previously spoken about immigration, about sort of people coming and taking jobs and things like that, but they are not talking about services. So as of now, at least from what I know, I don't foresee an immediate impact on services. So that's probably a good sign for us. And also, America is the world leader in services exports, right? So it actually, America exports far more services to other countries than any other country. So uh, hopefully we will avoid this kind of uncertainty and problems on the services side.
Right. And also, pharma sector have been exempted, and that's a good
Yes.
news, because there were a lot of speculation as far as sectors which are going to be hardest hit, and pharma
Yes.
was being featured in that list constantly, but it's being exempted. How do you see this move of giving exemption to the pharmaceutical sector?
Yeah, it's interesting. They have exempted 4 or 5 sectors. Steel and copper tubes is one. Pharma is another. Semiconductors is another. Right. So that's also very interesting. So, but I think here the calculus stays the same as it was previously. Right. So our competitiveness remains unchanged. Um, in other sectors, you can actually argue that we have become more competitive, right? Because China now has a 60 something percent tariff, right? Vietnam has a 90% tariff. Our tariff is only 26%. So, in some ways, you can argue that pharma uh, could even suffer from this, because Mexico or some other countries may become relatively much more competitive. But I think as of now, the pharma situation we should think of as being unchanged from what it was before. And for all the other sectors, there is a lot of uncertainty. Uh, Relative to some other of our competitor countries, our competitiveness has actually improved. Relative to the US itself, our competitiveness has dropped. So that's how I would look at it.
And let's talk about the fundamentals like rupee. How do you see rupee going forward? Do you think that it's going to be, and how the FIIs and FPIs are going to behave? Can you just tell us the kind of a movement that we are likely to see going forward in the markets, and as far as these rupee is concerned?
I think there's going to be a lot of uncertainty. My expectation is that the rupee will probably drop. Uh, I think the dollar should likely appreciate, because, again, it's just going to become less in demand from uh, importers and exporters, but it's going to become more in demand as a reserve currency, right? So just because there's going to be so much uncertainty, and I think in times of uncertainty, people always look for historically stable assets. So I think gold prices will likely rise. They have been rising a lot. Stock markets will likely drop. So these are the kinds of changes that I would expect. But of course, markets can fool anybody. But this is my expectation. I would expect that um, historically stable assets will rise.
Right. And also my last question, considering these level of tariffs are far higher than those tariffs that have been implemented in the history of the America. 1930s was at that time the tariffs were imposed and the US economy plunged into depression. How do
Yes.
you feel the US economy performing going forward? Do you think the trade deficit for which the entire thing has been done is going to reduce going forward? What will be the scenario as far as job creation in the US is concerned?
Great question. So it's a classic thing with tariffs, right? Whenever you impose them for a very brief period, it looks like things are improving. Trade deficit will get lower because, I mean, people will stop importing so much. But over time, all the other adjustments will come to play. The trade deficit will, because fundamental competitiveness does not change, right? So US workers will not become cheaper on the ground because tariffs are imposed. So just like they saw in the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, which you're referring to in the 1920s, I would expect this to be very bad news for the US economy and for the world economy. I think the US stock markets are sending the same signal. US stock markets have been dropping consistently ever since it became clear that Trump is very serious about across the board tariffs. So I would expect stock markets to continue dropping. I would expect job creation and the economy to suffer, although not maybe in the next few months. So, right, like, so I think in the short term, Trump will be able to declare victory. But in the medium term, even as short as I think 1 year to 1.5 years, we will definitely see higher inflation, very unpopular ratings for Trump, uh, drops in the US economy, drops in the US stock market. So this is going to be very negative for the US.
And what are the likely outcomes as far as 1 year horizon is concerned for India? Because if the global growth is going to be impacted, obviously we will
Yeah,
also feel the heat as far
yeah.
as India's GDP growth is concerned.
Yeah. So I think for India, we should treat this as a crisis moment. And I think some other people have been saying, I have been saying this to everyone who will listen, that crises are fantastic opportunities for reform, right? So uh, our backs are going to get pushed against the wall. Growth is going to be a problem. This is the moment that we can do the remaining agenda that was left over in 1991 for reform. We can reform our capital markets. We can reform our land markets. We can reform our labor markets. We can reform agriculture. And that is the golden opportunity that we have in front of us. Um, if we improve our fundamental competitiveness, tariffs will not matter to us in the long term. So all of these areas we protect specific products or specific jobs or specific sectors. We should instead decide that we will protect people, not products, right? So we should provide social insurance, we should provide direct benefit transfer, we should stop distorting markets. So we should allow our farmers to grow what they need without giving them free electricity or assuring them minimum support price. We should instead give them a direct cash transfer so that their welfare benefits are not threatened, that their livelihoods are not threatened. Um, but we should let them decide what they want to do.
Right. And since Trump is calling it as a discounted tariffs, do you feel that there can be situation going forward where he goes steps further and imposes more tariffs on the countries because it's a discounted tariffs, that's what he's calling. Do you expect the tariffs to rise further, or there will be some sort of a change as far as what he has announced today as far as tariffs are concerned?
I think Trump is very volatile as a person, right? So he does not embody consistency. If anything, he embodies chaos, right? So I very much think that these are uh, this is an initial shock and awe kind of moment. Uh, he wants deals to be struck. I think his one of his books was called Art of the Deal, right? And I fully expect him to try and take advantage of deals that he's striking with different countries in doing this. Um, I There have been allegations of sort of private benefit in the deals that he's trying to strike. I'm not going to um, lend credence to those, but certainly many people have alleged even those kinds of things. So I fully expect things to change. I fully expect that there will be a lot more uncertainty. He may raise tariffs on some countries, but he may drop them, right? So I think India has been negotiating very hard with the US. Just a few days ago, he announced that India may drop tariffs, etc. Right? So I fully expect that deals will be struck and things will change in the weeks to come.
And also, we are negotiating a bilateral trade agreement with US. So, going forward, do you feel that as the negotiation proceeds further, do you feel that the effect of these tariffs can be minimized as far as the negotiations in BTA is concerned?
Absolutely. And we should hope for that because that would be the best scenario. I think if we can negotiate an agreement where tariffs on India are much lower than tariffs for other people, um, in return for lower tariffs in India as well, I think that would be a fantastic situation. We have been saying, lots of economists have been pointing out that our recent measures that are trying to prevent trade from taking place are bad for us. So the same way that non-tariff barriers and tariff barriers are bad for the US, non-tariff barriers and tariff barriers are bad for India as well. Free trade is very, very helpful for us.
Right. And is this a beginning of a trade war? Because now we are seeing Canada has already talked about the retaliatory measure. Brazil is talking about it. And a lot of countries are not happy about it. And they are talking that they will go further with the retaliatory measure. So is this a beginning of a very severe trade war?
Unfortunately, I think that it is likely to happen. It would be great if it does not happen. So Israel, for instance, is a fantastic example of how things should be done. So Israel actually unilaterally lowered its tariffs to zero a few months ago, right? Because they realized that the economics says that the unilateral movement to zero on your end is the best thing that you can do for your country and your economy. So Israel has gone ahead and done that very smart move. There are several Canadian economists who have been saying that Canada should also do this, unilaterally move to zero tariffs. And I think that is the better thing to do. But unfortunately, economics is not intuitive to understand. People will approach it from a retaliatory perspective. I think it is very likely that we will get a trade war.
Right. So thank you, Rahul. And as far as conversation, the big takeaway is that volatility, uncertainty are going to be the buzzwords going further. And it will be present in the stock market, economy, and the global economy is widely going to be impacted because of this tariff. Thank you, Mr. Ahluwalia, for joining us and sparing time out and speaking to
Thank
Republic
you.
Media Network.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me.